Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Vienna, Austria. Joining us, as always, is Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, we're going to be talking about the new book, Abundance, by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. We'll get to that in a second. The book has made a big splash, especially among center-left Democrats, trying to figure out a new agenda. The authors put forward a kind of new policy agenda of their own, and we'll get to addressing that in just a bit. But first, we wanted to continue what we've been doing the last several weeks, which is trying to catch up on all that's happened in the past week by at least touching on the various developments that the Trump administration has been affecting. And yeah, Adam, a lot's happened in this past week as in the weeks before. To start off with, we are now approaching ever closer to the precipice of an outright constitutional crisis in the United States as the Trump administration acts defiantly towards federal courts, specifically in the case of deportation of Venezuelans to El Salvador, a deportation that one federal judge tried to stop, but the Trump administration continued with anyway. And their sort of outright defiance is raising this question of whether the United States' traditional separation of powers is going to emerge unscathed from this. The question that I came away with was how we should be thinking about the separation of powers at all, because we have three branches of government: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, and that's how I was taught growing up in the U.S. But at moments like this, it seems to become quite clear that this separation doesn't really have any kind of clear material basis, at least not if we're assuming there's an equality between the powers that are being separated. If the state is defined by its monopoly of force, which is, one way of defining the state that's come up on this podcast as well, isn't that power, that monopoly, concentrated in the executive branch? And then what even happens if the executive defies the judiciary? I mean, what is this separation of powers even based on?
It's a really fascinating question. I mean, it goes well beyond the purview of economics, and I'm no expert in American constitutional law. But I think, isn't the crucial point here that we shouldn't... So I think your question presumes what folks in American political history call the imperial presidency. In other words, that the executive branch is itself essentially at the beck and call of the president. And so we could be in the current situation in which the president and the people around him are acting against the will of the courts. And we're expecting the entire executive branch, all of it, including the men with guns, men and women with guns and uniforms and so on, to simply execute whatever the instructions of the president are. And I think that's where the rub is, because I think if you look at the oath taken by, and this has been an issue in the command chain under Trump before, if you look at the oath taken by enlisted soldiers, it starts with, I do solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, that I'll bear true faith and allegiance to the same. And then it goes on to say, I will obey the orders of the President of the United States and the orders of officers appointed above me. But if you look at the oath taken by officers, it's exclusively to the Constitution. So I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely. And apparently that was designed during the Civil War to ensure the loyalty of officers who might be suspected of having Confederate sympathies. But the point I'm trying to get to is that the armed branch, the uniform branch of the United States, certainly at senior levels, swears an oath not to the president, but to the Constitution. And that's the crucial point. So if then, in the judgment of the courts, or indeed in the personal judgment of senior soldiers, it's clear that orders they're being given are unconstitutional, then I don't think the path forward is clear, but a check of some kind clearly does begin to operate. And I think that's that's where we begin to see how this system is not as entirely one-sided as you're claiming. Now, this can operate in several different directions, and it does politicize the uniform branches of state power, and all of that becomes very messy very quickly. But I think in the case of what's going on, say, with ICE officers right now, these stories about French academics being detained at the border because their personal cell phones contain, communication critical of Trump. We can also say that there's another element here, which is beyond the legalities. It's clear that a substantial group within the American armed forces and police are actually just MAGA people and are acting out their MAGA fantasies within this frame. So it can cut both ways. You could have kind of a deep state liberal resistance, which the liberals in America were very unabashed about celebrating in the first Trump presidency, and the Trump people came in prepared for that and are therefore trying to drive a purge through the higher levels of the American command chain. And then on the other hand, you've got a kind of MAGA grassroots mobilization where folks are taking the opportunity to act out their MAGA fantasies of national power against hapless French academics who are trying to come to conferences in Texas or something. So I think this cuts both ways, but that I think is why this is not quite as straightforward as I agree it could appear at first glance. Police and military belong to the executive branch. Their president's the head of the executive branch. Case closed. If you actually look at crucial moments of crisis, like in 2020 when Milley was chairman of Joint Chiefs, a whole series of orders went out to the American officer class saying, remember what your oath actually says. It's not loyalty to the president. It is loyalty to the Constitution.
I mean, I guess just to follow this line of analysis, I guess it could be conceivable that the Supreme Court attempts to give orders to to security forces themselves, saying this is the true interpretation of the Constitution. Do not listen to the president.
Well, or perhaps rather, if I don't, this is where we get into legal zones. I'm not, but I imagine if you are a police officer and you high-handedly engage in the enforcement of a presidential instruction that clearly violates a court's judgment, you put yourself in jeopardy of disciplinary action and being found in contempt of court, right?
Yeah.
That's what happened to some of the Trump loyalists, Navarro and people like that. You end up being found in contempt of constitutional authorities, and at some point this catches up with you and you find yourself locked up.
Yeah, this is the point where the pardon power of the U.S. president becomes this troubling factor in U.S. politics.
It's bonkers. It's absolutely bonkers. Yeah, it's very anyway, but. Yeah. Is the American Constitution being tested right now? I wholeheartedly agree with you. Yes, evidently.
But I guess to follow up with a question that actually just came up in a meeting at Foreign Policy right before I got on here, which was the question, and this may become peace in foreign policy somewhere down the line, is if there is an outright constitutional crisis, would that affect the basis of U.S. power in some way? And I guess specifically from an economic perspective, does history suggest that a country that sort of ceases to have the rule of law would be undermined in international economic markets? Or do sort of authoritarian takeovers in other countries suggest that markets wouldn't frown even necessarily upon that kind of shift?
Well, in the US case, the key thing is the treasury market. And it really depends on how they approach that issue. And what's really astonishing about the Trump people is that they even seem willing to play fast and loose with that. But it's been talk so far, and it's been silly talk, and it hasn't been talk by serious people insofar as we can speak of serious people in the Trump administration this time round. The Mar-a-Lago Accord idea involves some sort of reprofiling of American debt, which will be profoundly damaging to that asset class. But then that's part of the plan, right? They want to make US treasuries less attractive for foreign investors. We're testing the limit. I did actually see it, and there may have been early ones, but I saw the first, bank advisory research note from, admittedly, I think coming out of London, which was, is the United States still investable? Which is, the code word for don't put your money there. And we've seen what's happened in the stock market in recent months. The sheer insanity of the decision-making process over tariffs has really has really damaged confidence.
But that doesn't have to do with, constitutional crisis per se. That has to do with kind of just a lack of predictability in economic policy.
But that's a narrow interpretation of the Constitution. I mean, I think, the debt element is actually in the Constitution for good reasons. But I think, as far as markets and investors are concerned, the Constitution is more than simply the division of powers. That it is a set of understandings about what founds modern America. And those are, in many key areas, no longer just around the edges, being troubled. Like America's settled relations with Canada are not simply a matter of foreign policy. I mean, after all, the president is saying we ought to add Canada as a 51st state. That's a constitutional matter. So, see what I mean? I think it's blurry. It's very blurry. And I think a crisis in the American military command chain, would that shake confidence? Absolutely it would, yeah. The question, of course, is how markets respond to that and where you diversify into. And the irony has always been that you end up running into dollars, in moments of uncertainty. I don't know whether that would hold this time around. In a bewildering way, the Trump team seem willing to leave all of these questions kind of dangling right now.
Well, to shift to another item in the news, one that's, not really any less troubling, namely what's happening in Gaza. Israel seems to be potentially preparing to restart its war there as the ceasefire breaks down, or as Israel decides to curtail the ceasefire. And I'm curious about your perspective on what America's policy is here. And I suppose this is in the same vein as we were just talking about the lack of rationality in economic policy. It strikes me that, America's de facto Gaza policy is, kind of exclusively in the domain of fantasy, with Trump imagining Gaza somehow eventually coming under U.S. control still. I'm just curious about the relationship between fantasy and material policy. And I these are abstract issues, but these are strange times. I mean, at what point does kind of just fantasy become its own material fact or independent policy reality?
Yeah, I think Title VII strictures require me to say, I'm not kidding here, that I believe it's the Israeli government or maybe the Israeli state has decided that it's had enough of the ceasefire and is resuming hostilities. I believe if we use the phrase Israel, we may be in violation of Title VII norms. I'm just trying to remember, but I'm just saying that. And I'm not saying you should change anything you say, but I'm struggling to remember the instructional video that I was subjected to. And I believe that is the qualification we're supposed to add. And you could see how tenuous and weird it is, because what we mean when we say Israel is the Israeli state, and presumably the IDF is the Israeli state. And so when we say Israel took the lives of over 400 Palestinian civilians, that should be a permissible statement. Anyway, that's what's going on.
This is a video that Columbia University showed you? I just want to clarify.
Yes, requires us to take, yeah. And it's very subtle and it's very complicated, and it's very thought-provoking, shall I say, about how we talk about history and politics and the shorthands that we use. What we mean is that the Israeli government has instructed the Israeli military to resume the bombing of Gaza, and the Israeli forces are reoccupying slices of Gaza, and it's extracting very, very large, huge civilian casualty toll. And yes, as you say, none of this has ever really had. I mean, I think this is the point, right? There is this extra dollop of Trump crazy, the Trump Gaza AI, vision that he actually personally recirculated, which is truly a grotesque moment in Trump's long list of grotesqueries. But the more fundamental point surely is that, and that's an element, so that, to your point, is an element of like explicit, insane fantasy. If people haven't seen it, Google it. It's truly one of the weirdest things you'll ever see in your life. Utterly extraordinary. Involves like gold statues of the man himself and Netanyahu and Trump in relatively like realistic, aged, middle-aged bodies lying around at a pool. It's all absolutely quite extraordinary. But the horrifying fact is, of course, that aside from these fantasies are in a sense trying to fill a void, and the void they're trying to fill is that this entire operation has never really had a day after plan, right? There has never really been a day after plan. There isn't a day after plan. And these fantasies fill that void. So the fantasies themselves are grotesque and totally unrealistic, but they are a response to a real fact, which is that this campaign has been waged and it has no conceivable endpoint. I mean, it's been made abundantly clear by all of the neighboring states. The idea of somehow shipping the Palestinian population out there is a non-starter. And so you end up in these even more grotesque ideas of moving these people to some place in Africa, in inverted commas, which is genuine. I mean, it's a truly bizarre kind of derailment of thinking. And so in a sense, the fantasy of like the Trump Riviera is, one of the slightly more conventional elements of the unreality which characterizes this moment.
Okay, well then with that, let's shift to our main subject for today's podcast, namely the book Abundance, and the data point there is $2.5 billion. That's $2.5 billion per mile. Those are the construction costs for the most recent phase of the New York City subway system. That makes it the most expensive subway system construction project in the world. And this is a fact that the authors Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson draw attention to and lament in their new book, Abundance,
which argues, quote, to have the future we want, we need to build and invent more of what we need. It's great to have you both.
Gentlemen, you wrote a book about an optimistic future, about reforming America's institutions. Why delve into sci-fi?
It's a good deep question.
The authors advocate for a new program that they describe as supply-side liberalism. They suggest this is the program that the Democrats ought to adopt in their period in opposition right now as a way of coming back to power and delivering growth for the American people writ large, and more specifically, reinvigorating liberalism for a new era by making government more effective and by producing more in the name of liberalism. And yeah, I thought we could unpack what this book argues and its general relevance at this particular moment. And that's, I guess, where I wanted to start, because a lot of people are describing this book as especially timely right now as the Democrats seek a new agenda. But I guess I'm curious whether it is timely at all in another respect. I mean, Republicans right now are, fundamentally setting out to damage the state. And Klein and Thompson are advocating new ways of thinking about state capacity. But with Republicans kind of dismantling the state entirely, how relevant is state capacity at all? I mean, do Democrats actually need to be thinking much more defensively at this point above all else, kind of like trying to save the state entirely rather than kind of making it more efficient in the ways this book describes?
Yeah, I'm with you on this. I mean, I really had to steel myself, I must admit, to read this, because I mean, it's a very readable book. It's easy, it's easygoing, it's interesting, it flows. But the reason why is just that it seems like it's a blast from the past. I was involved in extended conversations. Some people may have heard the podcast I did with Ezra, which I think was in 2021 when this was gestating, and it took me back so hard. And in the current moment, in the state that we're in 2025, with the pressures, that particularly we're under at Columbia University, it just seemed like a message in a bottle somehow. I mean, I think of it as like a lost manifesto for a second Democratic administration. And I think, I mean, it must, for Klein in particular, it must have been anguishing finishing this and then putting it into the incredibly slow-moving process of book production, because he was one of the most, very much to his credit, like he was one of the most prescient major commentators on the disaster of the Biden-Harris sequence in 2024. I mean, he was brave, he was out front, he was calling for Biden to go, then he was calling for a convention. I mean, he was, or at least discussing the options, and he was obviously, this is not just any old journalist. This is one of the most influential voices in the Democratic camp in the US, and who clearly was, talking to people at the very highest levels, including in the White House, and so he must have seen this disaster coming, and also, therefore, in a sense, the obsolescence of the book that he was writing, because this really does, I think, this should have been the manifesto, and oh my word, it would have been relevant if that were the world that we were in, but the Democrats managed to do just about everything conceivable to ensure that that didn't happen. I mean, they are now, making a sturdy effort to present the book as relevant, and I've heard Klein pitch this as, the backdrop to thinking about populism, because scarcity is the fuel that populism feeds off, and that's the rhetoric of populism, and they want to offer abundance as an alternative for that reason. I mean, they're not going there, but another way, I think, of reading this book as relevant to my mind was, that this is what Doge would be like if you were doing it right. This is the sort of reform of government. They're all about the reforming, thinking about government at quite a comprehensive cultural, political level, but of course in a much more constructive way than Doge. They even have an entire chapter on the NIH, on the National Institute of Health, and its problems. It's not, it's on the one hand, it's a complex celebration, but also criticism. And then, God help us, the broader historical framing of the book is about the legacies of reformism and liberal politics in the US since the 1960s. And as I was invoking just a minute ago, the Title VII that I was invoking as constraining my speech on Palestine and Israel right now is Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? A huge monument in the history of democracy in the United States. Indeed, you could say at the global level, right? This was America trying finally to get its house in order and in some way at least address the stain, the shame, the disaster of chattel slavery and its long consequences in Jim Crow. And that is what is being mobilized against, I would argue, against free speech on campuses like Columbia's. And the lever is NIH funding and the big government apparatus of science. So this book really speaks to the world that we're in, but it does so in an imagined a future which has not turned out to be ours. It's quite, I find it quite painful to read, I must admit.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break right here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about the book Abundance. I mean, what is the genealogy of the anti-abundance groups that the authors are opposing? I mean, basically, there is this liberal camp with kind of opposing forces. This, again, sort of this abundance, state capacity faction, and then this kind of more accountability-minded anti-abundance faction that they're kind of opposing themselves to. And I'm curious whether you think they're being too dismissive of their opponents. Is this just a kind of swinging of the pendulum, or do they offer a plausible synthesis somehow that reconciles these opposing political forces in liberalism?
I think there are, the book has got three major points of focus: the research complex, the NIH, infrastructure, and housing. And maybe we should stand back and say, why are they talking about these things? They're talking about these things because their basic thesis is that American society and progressive politics in particular should operate on the front foot. It should operate towards the future, and it should operate towards a qualitatively improving expansion of the available resources for American society. And by that, they mean families and people. And that it's a kind of a humanist project, right? And they argue that we've been locked in an increasingly constricting, self-defeating system of constraints, for which they then provide a history, and where they, on those three axes at least, well, they point to the problem. I don't really think you could say they offer solutions, but they alert us to problems in all those three areas. And with regards to science and infrastructure, I think the account is it's a little thin. It's about sclerosis in a sense. It's the accumulation of more and more conservative checks and balances. On the housing side, which is the most fleshed out bit of the story, I think they offer really quite an interesting story. Whether you find it convincing or not is another question. And there's some empirical research which says that really housing is ultimately driven by the cost of housing, that is, and the huge gap between the cost of housing in blue New York or California and red state Texas. Houston is the example they cite over and over again. And it's a factor of 4 or 5x. So I think the average house in Houston's about $300,000, and the average home in the hotspots of growth like New York and California in blue states, because Houston is itself a major growth area, you can't buy a place to live there. The average place anyway is, over $1 million and heading towards 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 million in the Bay Area. So this is the problem. And how do we explain how we got there? Well, with regard to housing, their argument is it isn't just demand. The conventional economist argument would be it's fundamentally just a demand-driven story. They argue that really deep down, the basic problem is supply. We just aren't building enough houses and apartments in the blue state areas. And the logic they offer for this is quite tricky. It's quite interesting. Housing specialists would have to adjudicate really in the end how convincing this is. But it starts with, and this is why genealogy is quite a good description for it, because it's genealogy, say in Foucauldian terms, is a history that is a kind of a haphazard, complex, non-unitary kind of logic to it. So this story starts with a reform story. It starts with a New Deal and the creation of the publicly subsidized standard mortgage in the United States. And the public subsidy for private ownership of housing in the US is gigantic. And the entire mortgage market is rigged towards that. We don't have to get into the details. We could talk about that on some other episode. But what that does is to suck initially middle class and then increasingly prosperous working class assets and savings into the housing market. And this is, from a financial point of view, very bad news, because it's extremely risky to have such a one-sided commitment to an asset that's not diversified, that's exposed to lots and lots of local risks. And so then the story goes, okay, if you've built a home-owning middle class, shall we call them, how are they going to defend their asset? Well, you can't financially defend an asset of this type. So what you do is you use legal means to defend this asset and ensure that its value remains the same. And this becomes particularly pressing in a world of inflation from the 1970s onwards, where more and more money is pouring into housing as a nest egg. But how do you ensure your nest egg against what the Americans call blight, which is decay, infrastructure failure, the wrong type of people moving in? They don't really address the issue of race head on, but of course it lurks in the background always in American stories like this. And so their answer is you use law. And then the story jumps all the way back to the 19th century and Tocqueville and the common observation that America is a society held together by law. And then the next question is, well, what laws do you mobilize if what you want to do is to protect housing assets against the wrong people moving in or the wrong type of building construction going on around you? Where then they cite 3 elements of law. The first is urban zoning, which has a history that accumulates from the beginning of the 20th century onwards, and of course is initially a reform project which becomes more and more restrictive and becomes really binding in many parts of the United States. So these are rules about what kind of buildings can be built in what areas, and what they classically do is require large, gardens or even estates around houses. In the suburbs, you see this quite a lot. You have to own acres, or in the cities, it's restrictions on the height of buildings. So those are one element. Then you have the civil rights movement of the 60s, which makes courts into heroes and focuses the attention of progressive activism on legal means as the main way forward. And then environmentalism enters the story from the 1960s onwards, which was a suburban movement in America first. And environmentalism in its modern form is an American invention, culminating in Earth Day in 1970, which is the biggest environmental demonstration in history. And it's a reaction to the really wanton, destructive growth of America in that period. And I'm old enough to remember what growth in America was like in the early 70s. And it was dirty and polluting and dangerous and nasty. And environmental protections are the thing that comes into place. And all of this apparatus, if you like, of assets unduly focused on housing, the legal bias of American progressivism, the handles of environmental protection above all and zoning, create a matrix, a web within which progressive politics in the US has increasingly entangled the business of building buildings. And that is the kind of nitty-gritty of their story about how progressive politics melds together from the 70s onwards to create the basis through which NIMBYism is mobilized. So not in my backyard politics is mobilized in defense of this core asset of home ownership. So it's a materialist argument compounded by a political culture argument, compounded by a kind of ironic twisting of various reform projects. And undoing that, rethinking progressive politics so as to enable us to move past this is the project of the book. And whether or not they succeed, I think, is an open question. We could talk more about it, but this was already a long enough answer. But this diagnosis is what the book is offering. And it's a historical account. It's a sort of social scientific account. At some level, it's also a cultural demand that progressivism and liberalism back itself out of this sort of Bermuda Triangle of constraints that it has constructed since the 70s, and recognize implicitly what they're saying is recognize the political economy that underpins this, which in blue states anyway consists in the dogged defense of incumbent interest in real estate against the construction of new property. That's at least on new places for people to live. So they have this rather... It's very aggressive. It's a little unfair, this contrast between, liberal Californian homes with their Black Lives Matter posters, in the windows and on the front lawn, and those same homeowners mobilizing to prevent the construction of affordable housing, which predominantly falls on the lowest income and minority populations in the United States.
Yeah, that is a very helpful description of their diagnosis. And yeah, it strikes me that they ideally, or one would ideally try to describe or analyze why the United States has as legalistic a culture as it always has had. Because, yeah, in the absence of that, you're effectively sort of taking, one side against the other. Or, it strikes me that they talk a lot about trade-offs, but I'm not always sure that they're being entirely forthright about the trade-offs that they're engaging in themselves. And yeah, to some extent, it strikes me that, they're kind of like equating, advocates of austerity with advocates of accountability in public processes. And there's some sleight of hand potentially in some of what they are up to in the book. But yeah, fundamentally, this is just like the United States has been a low-trust society, and then that's why it's always been a kind of legalistic culture. Then there's a kind of more fundamental point that is actually harder to kind of solve. It seems like they kind of fantasize about an effective administrative state, but there might be some fundamental kind of problem that is just harder to address. But I guess I'm to get to some of their prescriptions about production and their supply side growth that they imagine. Obviously, they're advocates of further growth, but I'm curious, who do they presume should decide what should be produced in the first place? I mean, does their book give too much credence to ultimately to the capitalist perspective on what ought to be built?
I mean, I don't think it does. And to link together this question with that very insightful comment you just made, Cam, I mean, I think what they're trying to argue is that, yes, America has always had this legalistic culture. And this is a book, let's not make any bones about it. Anyone reading it outside the US will be struck. It's a intensely American book for an American audience. It ends with pages discussing the American character as though this was a thing. But anyway, it's all that. But their argument, to their credit, is that there's some possibility of movement here. And the argument basically is that the America has been trapped by both the advocates of government and the opponents of government in a formalistic model of legitimation, right? By means of procedure, ultimately, in other words, by means of legality. And that's why this is a lawyering culture. And their argument is that what that does is to displace and to strangle what even in the United States could potentially be an alternative form of legitimation. And after all, for American society as a whole and for American capitalism is the ultimate form of legitimation, which is output legitimacy. In other words, the making of things and the doing of things quickly, right? They cite the instance of this terrible accident on I-95 and the relatively rapid actions of the Pennsylvania governor to fix the bridge and how popular that was. Like, Americans do believe, perhaps there's in this deep historical way in law, but they're not blind to the attractions of good things being done quickly in an affordable way, right? And their argument is, we need to bootstrap our way out of the legalistic, formalistic impasse towards a better future by way of rebalancing formal and substantive legitimation, procedural and output legitimacy, and regain, therefore, a foothold. And this whole book is overshadowed in a way that only really becomes clear in the final pages by China. Right? That's the ultimate argument here, is that America is the great shining city, city on the hill or whatever it is losing to China, which is nothing if not the demonstration of the power of output legitimacy. So then what decides the output, which is your next question? And I would argue that it really isn't, in their view, business or the market or profit. They, in fact, have these rather strange sections where they kind of face and then dodge the question of how economists calculate the standard of living and real wages and so on. And they say, well, televisions have gotten cheaper, but homes have gotten more expensive. And somehow, though our real wages increase, we're worse off. Whereas an economist would say, well, no, actually, we aren't, because the measure I'm using is supposed to capture that the apartment's more expensive. So either you're saying that you don't believe in the data, or you're saying that my data are wrong. But essentially, therefore, the Klein and Thompson argument is not really an economist's argument. It's really more sort of basic needs, Aristotelian kind of stuff, where they're basically saying, look, we all know what Americans need to be flourish, to be prosperous. We all know. Let's stop arguing with each other. We all know. What is it? Well, it's housing, it's healthcare, which is why all the innovation matters. And they go on a lot about, quite rightly, I think, about Operation Warp Speed. It's education, though they don't say anything about that. It's childcare, they don't say anything about that either. It's the internet, that's the infrastructure part. So those are the basic needs. And the agenda of this book is to deliver those, for government to take a more constructive role in delivering those for the American population. And that is that is going to be the politics of abundance. It's not abundance in general. It's not growthmanship in general. It's actually this, kind of, dare I say it, like kind of Brooklyn progressive liberal vision of what a good life consists of. And it consists of these basics that need to be provided. And they start with this. Well, it becomes clear it's like derived from the 1960s World Fair, but this image of, of waking up in America in 2050, it's really a Good Morning Reagan style, Good Morning in America 2050 kind of vision. And it's, it's the satisfaction of all of these needs by green and efficient and cheap means. That's what abundance is about. So I don't see the market or profit really being a key element of the argument, though they lurk in the background. It's really, how do we get these things that we all agree that we need? Implicitly, it's saying, and the statistics don't tell us how unaffordable they've become. And so therefore, we're living in a fantasy world in which we think we're well off, but in fact, we aren't. And it's that discrepancy that ultimately is the source of our discontent. And it's that what populism rides in on. And Democratic Party politics needs to seize on this and address it, not by more formal mechanism, by better representation, all of that. No, not that. That's everything Babel liberalism. It's by delivering. Give us bridges, give us roads, give us metros, give us, housing, give us all of that. That's how we're going to get there.
Yeah, no, that's all, I think, a fair analysis. I mean, I guess in my mind, as I was reading it a bit, was, I guess, the question of how much of a consensus is there really on what we all want? And, do they address the objections of someone like Kenneth Galbraith, who they raise, but I feel like are quite dismissive of in terms of analyzing how growth and the products of growth can can go wrong or sort of just end up producing things in the wrong direction. I don't know if they actually offer a kind of answer to his analysis.
They really don't. There's very little political economy in this book beyond the kind of account I just gave you of the housing crisis. They do something a little bit similar for infrastructure, but, corporate capital, the military industrial complex, big platform businesses, none of those make any appearance in this book. Not at the center. It's not a Lena Khan kind of antitrust kind of vision. And to that extent, I don't think it has to be read as a political manifesto, because it is a sort of message to the American PMC. It's kind of, we need to buck ourselves up and we need to stop, being distracted. We need to focus on the delivery of various types. It has that kind of feel to it. And I think if you read it in these terms as a kind of almost a morality tale, you get closer to it than Galbraith or somebody like that's effort at really doing a kind of social scientific analysis of American capitalism at the time.
Well, yeah, part of that morality tale clearly is an emphasis on innovation as a necessity. And it struck me in reading that chapter that there's an overlap between the book Abundance and a recent speech that Vice President J.D. Vance delivered, envisioning a kind of melding of populism and the innovation of Silicon Valley as a new coalition on the right. And I'm curious if you think, there is this overlap in terms of these economic agendas and their emphasis in innovation between the center-left vision and J.D. Vance's, I think fair to say, further right vision. Is this a kind of evidence of a new consensus, or how should we make sense of that?
I mean, I see what you mean. I mean, I was struck even more by the parallels with Musk at some level. After all, the NIH has been in the crosshairs of what the Trump administration has done. The implicit argument of the Musk people, if we can break the universities, we can break NIH because the innovation model currently doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. And it works in entities like SpaceX and Tesla, but it doesn't work in the establishment. I think we should, reading this book and thinking about Musk, I really do think we should do an episode or maybe a whole series on innovation and how people think about it. I think it's important to have that conversation. So I think there are some rather uncanny parallels at that level. But Klein, who's the person I haven't watched as many videos that Thompson's done, but there's a very good conversation with Klein, Thompson, and somebody from The Atlantic magazine, in which Klein, I think it's his voice, faces this parallelism, structural homology kind of point and says, no, look, you don't understand. This is about our ultimate aims. I mean, sure, at some level there may be formal similarities. Sure, we're also arguing about the quality of government. Yes, we are also agreeing there's things wrong with government, but the fundamental difference is that people from the right, for whatever reasons, believe that, we shouldn't do various types of public education service. They genuinely believe we shouldn't be providing Medicaid to, poor Americans. They genuinely believe we should be slashing foreign aid. And sure, they're also critical of USAID as a government agency, but in the background, they basically believe that foreign aid should be cut, right? And so the formal similarities pale by comparison with the substantial differences, which is that their vision is radically different on all of these points. And I think I congratulate Klein on making this as forcefully as he does. That's exactly the line they ought to be riding. Why is it, however, that we keep coming back to these similarities? And I think this is a point which is fair to make, is that both within the Democratic camp and within the Republican camp, what we're seeing is sort of culture change, bridging type moves. And at that level of abstraction, not at the level of they're all in favor of innovation and various types of national industrial policy and so on, that I think is not the level to go at. I think if you stand back and say the conjuncture of American politics in the current moment is so disturbed that, in a sense, neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party know what they are right now, or should be, or how they would really build legitimacy and governing coalitions in regards to the American public, who is, broadly speaking, pissed off with both of them. And, the legitimacy of Congress is at absolutely, abysmal levels, as are the legitimacy of all public institutions. Both parties if one, I think, is fair to them, are trying to answer that question. And at that level, I think there really is a structural similarity. So standing back as a historian and thinking about this, I would feel comfortable in saying that they are in that same space as Vance, as some of these other figures in the Republican Party on the front lines. It's like the Hawleys and the Rubios we once upon a time would have said, and then it's the Orrin Casses and these kind of people, which we've spoken about on the show a couple of times. And then Klein and Thompson, I think, are doing structurally a similar kind of job within the Democratic Party. But, and this is crucial to insist on, just very different objectives.
Yeah, well, then I suppose if we could maybe end with a bit more contemporary history, I wanted to ask about another parallel that came to mind, because it struck me that in some ways the book was trying to restore a spirit from a few years earlier, namely the kind of liberal optimism that was so palpable during the Obama era, when, there was also little hesitation to kind of offer visions of a liberal future of the kinds that the authors are describing in their book, and in a similarly kind of technocratic vein. And for me, that raised the question of why did that optimism dissipate when it did? I mean, the people from the Obama era, which not so long ago, were probably aware of the same issues that Klein and Thompson are describing, and certainly were similarly motivated in terms of their idealism, and yet things eventually kind of broke down in this level in terms of the vision. And I'm just curious what to make of that. I mean, are we just kind of rehearsing this recent history again in terms of eventually discovering, a new desire for accountability after we've sort of endorsed abundance, and kind of searching for then, responses for equitability, and then leading to searches for structural causes, and then just sort of coming full circle again? I mean, what do you make of the parallels with the Obama era and how that turned out?
I was really surprised by this question, because I don't remember the Obama era as being an
early
era of
Obama
optimism.
era. I mean, that to me struck me as this kind of liberal moment. Maybe it was my youthful. Maybe it was my sort of youthful.
That is my hypothesis. I was literally looking up online as you were speaking, like, how old is Cam? How old is Cam? So how old are you, Cam? Sorry, if I may ask.
I'm 42, which is, I'm guessing, the same age as the authors of the book.
Klein.
Exactly.
So it's conceivable that the two of you have this memory of the Obama era. I don't get it. Like, I remember, I mean, and in retrospect, even more, I think of the Obama period as one, if you think of foreign policy and so on, as like an era of a new kind of very sober realism, really, contradicted by Hillary Clinton, who was always the kind of turd in the punch bowl on this. But like at the core of the Obama administration is a kind of an acceptance of limits, actually. And they are, after all, acting under the desperate pressure of the financial crisis and being harried from the right by Trump, literally Trump, on the birther tip, and then the Tea Party. So I don't get it. I don't feel that. And then in the economist area, we had secular stagnation, the inequality problem coming to the fore. But let me answer your question. I mean, what kind of optimism is it they're mainlining? And is this a cyclical view? The optimism that hangs over this entire book is not that of the New Deal. It's interesting. So online, you'll see loads of, the usual suspects, or my mates in various different ways, arguing about this and going back and forth to an extent I can't even follow. It's so complicated right now, the conversation. But one thing that's noticeable is that this is not a New Deal-centric book. They use Gary Gerstle, who was an important figure in New Deal historiography, and has this kind of episodic notion of American history that new orders are created, and one was clearly created in the New Deal period, and then another under neoliberalism. But the book itself doesn't really have that. Doesn't have that vibe. This is not a Green New Deal FDR kind of book. They hardly say anything about the New Deal. I think in some senses maybe because the distributional politics are just too complicated, and they don't really want to talk about distributional politics. In other words, class conflict about who gets what. They're really stepping aside from that. Grow the cake, deliver these things. That's what we need to focus on. output legitimacy. That's the key. So where do they find their source of optimism? It's the 60s. I mean, and they end with, Johnson at the World's Fair, touting this vision. And Johnson, in rather dark terms, spoke about abundance or annihilation because Johnson is worried about the Cold War. And they have this like much more anodyne kind of opposition of abundance and scarcity. And we can outgrow this. So there's almost, it's kind of almost willfully Jetsons style kind of revival of American future. It's so camp almost. I kind of find it hard to believe they mean it seriously. I think they do though. And the story they're telling, I would think of as less cyclical than dialectical, except it's not quite obvious they quite really believe. You at one point used the word synthesis in your notes for me, and I think that gets us there. So the thesis is 60s growthmanship, right? The antithesis is 70s environmentalism, liberalism turning towards a restrictive politics. And they don't want to give up on either of those two elements. Why would you if you're an American liberal? Because they both are key legacies, right? Environmentalism is something they're profoundly committed to. Climate frames this entire book, which is another one of the reasons why it feels so strangely out of time. So climate frames this entire book. And on the other hand, of course, you can't give up on civil rights and the breakthroughs of the Great Society moment, American society. But how do we combine these things with each other is really the question they're trying to answer. And that's where then they make these leaps into, well, if we could just unscrew this mess that we're in, that would be one step. And if we could then think of focusing on innovation and new ways of innovation, then we could claim the future. And that's the promise of this agenda.
Got it. Yeah, I'll have to reflect on my memory of the early Obama era. Clearly, they hit constraints, but the sort of fundamental kind of technocratic claim that the government could kind of lead some liberal renaissance, I think, was there at the beginning. But I'll think some more about it.
Yeah, we should. This is also a good show. We should do that. We should. Why don't we? We should do an episode about memories of Obama. We'll have to find the right hook, but I actually think maybe Obama will say something publicly in the current moment. Who knows? Do you think he might conceivably intervene? Sorry to be catty, but where the hell is he? And, just conceivably, he might intervene, which would give us cause to look back on his presidency and have a think about our difference there.
Well, here's hoping that that's an occasion for us to reflect back on his time. But for now, our time is up for this week. But we will be back in a week from now, as always. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.